September 28th, daylight. The monsters have overtaken the city. Somehow, I'm still alive.
Resident Evil 3 Nemesis was released, depending on where you lived, in September or November of 1999 or February of 2000 for the original PlayStation. It was put into production quickly following the tremendous critical and commercial success of its immediate predecessor, Resident Evil 2. The game was being produced by Shinji Mikami, the creator of the Resident Evil franchise, and directed by Hideki Kamiya, the director of the previous game. It was going to be set on a cruise liner and would star Hunk, the fourth survivor from the special unlockable scenario of the same name from Resident Evil 2. After escaping the destruction of Raccoon City in the previous game, the game would follow Hunk as he tried to make it back to Umbrella with the G-Virus, where some terrible circumstances would presumably befall him. And if none of this sounds familiar in the slightest, that's because the original Resident Evil 3 that was put into production was cancelled. The concept of a Resident Evil game set on a cruise liner would be reused later on in Resident Evil Gaiden on Game Boy. Sony had just announced the PlayStation 2 release, and Capcom didn't want the PlayStation generation to end without another entry in the Resident Evil franchise on the console. The original PlayStation was the best-selling home console in history, and Resident Evil was one of the most recognizable tentpole franchises on the system, and Capcom presumably wanted to keep the momentum going from the incredibly well-received second game. The developer had put multiple Resident Evil titles into production to capitalize on the franchise's success. And so, after cancelling what was to be Resident Evil 3 and shifting Kamiya and his team onto production of Resident Evil 4, one of the spin-off games in development was chosen to be the next main numbered entry in the series. The game was being directed by newcomer Kazuhiro Aoyama, who was leading a less experienced development team in creating a game that starred a brand new protagonist attempting to escape Raccoon City during the initial outbreak. When the game was promoted to the status of main sequel, Capcom decided that the protagonist should be Jill Valentine, a returning character from the original Resident Evil. Previously playable characters Chris and Claire Redfield were both already slated to appear in the already in development Resident Evil Code Veronica, and Leon Kennedy would go on to star in Resident Evil 4, and probably wouldn't have made a great deal of sense as the star of Resident Evil 3, given that it takes place at the same time as Resident Evil 2, which he also starred in. Resident Evil 3 released to yet more critical acclaim for the series, and that might sound surprising to you in 2020. After the release of the Resident Evil 3 remake in April, a game whose critical consensus was a lot more divided than 2019's incredibly well-received Resident Evil 2 remake, some pointed out that this followed the pattern of the original releases of those two games, namely that Resident Evil 2 was a critical darling, and Resident Evil 3's reception was lukewarm. As someone who streamed the entirety of Resident Evil 3 Remake during its launch weekend, reviewed the game here at Words About Games, sat on a podcast to discuss the game at length, and generally had lots of Remake 3 themed conversations in mid-2020, I heard this claim repeated a lot. I mean, in April, Time magazine ran an article with the headline, "The Resident Evil 3 Nemesis Remake takes a shot at resurrecting the franchise's weakest game." Its weakest game. Its weakest game? Weakest. I guess they perhaps just completely forgot one Resident Evil game in particular, or like half a dozen of them. There's not even any ambiguity in the headline either. It's not one of the weakest games, or a weaker game. No, apparently it's the worst game in a series that includes Resident Evil 6, and Gun Survivor, or Umbrella Corps. Like, what the fuck? This criticism never really sat right with me. It didn't jive with my memories of playing Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, or of what I remembered of the critical consensus at the time. But that was more than 20 years ago, however, so I did what anyone who thought they were misremembering the past would do. Research. According to GameRankings.com, Metacritic doesn't hold a listing for the PlayStation release of Resident Evil 3, given that the site was fairly new at the time. The game averaged an 88 from 35 reviews, which is only 5 points lower than the 93 based on 25 reviews held by Resident Evil 2. Now, Metacritic or GameRankings or whatever review aggregation service you use is not the be-all and end-all of determining a game's quality, but it is useful when trying to figure out what the critical reception was for a game around the time it was released. So, let's take a look at what some of the reviews actually said. Official PlayStation magazine called the game a modern-day classic. CVG praised the game for preserving the best features of its predecessors while adding exciting new elements. IGN was particularly enthusiastic about the game's recreation of a devastated Raccoon City, the new 180 turn and dodge mechanics, and the live-action choices. GamePro lavished praise on Resident Evil 3's audio design, and the introduction of Nemesis, a T-1000-inspired enemy that stalked players across Raccoon City, was widely applauded across the board. There were some fairly universal criticisms of the game's length, as Resident Evil 3 featured only one campaign instead of the two from the previous entry, or four if you count both A and B scenarios as separate campaigns. The game's voice acting was also criticised in some reviews, but...
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
So critics loved the game at the time, despite a narrative forming later that Resident Evil 3 was noticeably weaker than its predecessor. Which, I guess that's fair cop. You could also argue that critics thought less of The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask, given that it was the follow-up to Ocarina of Time, widely heralded as one of the greatest games of all time, and the only game to hold a 99 average on Metacritic, compared to Majora's Mask's paltry 95. But that argument, while technically correct, would probably be a bit disingenuous, and not just because Majora's Mask is the superior game. People are allowed to change their minds, however. I've done it loads. And it has been 20 years since Resident Evil 3 first came out, sandwiched between the most beloved game in the series in Resident Evil 2, and the game that reinvented the series and kind of kickstarted the third-person action genre we know and love today in Resident Evil 4. Maybe the game just doesn't hold up under those circumstances, and people realised they were too high on the 1999/2000 release. Well, there was only one way for me to really find that out, and that was to play the game again. Now, so I made sure to set my expectations to the right level by replaying Resident Evil 2 beforehand. My retrospective review on that game can be summarised as, yep, that's still a damn fine game. So with 20 years of gaming history and my abject disappointment in Resident Evil 3 Remake under my belt, I sat down to play Resident Evil 3 Nemesis and see if it was still as good as I remembered. Okay, this video could get confusing if I don't clarify some terminology right now, because I'm probably going to reference the Resident Evil 3 Remake quite a bit throughout. So, when I'm talking about 1999's Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I'll simply call it Resident Evil 3, and when I'm talking about 2020's Resident Evil 3 Remake, I'll call it Remake 3. Cool? Cool. For context, a shorter version of my own thoughts on Resident Evil 3, pre-replaying it, can be found in my Resident Evil Games Ranked video, which I made just before the release of Remake 3, where I ranked the game 4th, just behind RE2 Remake and just ahead of the first game. Here's an excerpt. I loved exploring the labyrinthine streets of Raccoon City. I loved the slightly more action-focused take on Resident Evil that the third iteration provided, without the game going overboard on said action. And I loved dodging Nemesis as the hulking monstrosity stalked your movements. So, where do I stand on Resident Evil 3, having replayed the game in 2020? Pretty much at the same place, to be honest. If I was redoing the ranks again, I might even bump it up ahead of Resident Evil 2 Remake, which would amusingly make my top 3 Resident Evil Remake, Resident Evil 2, and then Resident Evil 3, because apparently I'm a sucker for some chronological ordering in my lists, apparently. Even playing the game over 20 years after its initial release, I found a lot to love in this game. I'd braced myself to find the game dated, clunky, and surpassed by the many, many years of advancement and evolution of video games. But the game honestly holds up pretty well. I mean, you can definitely tell the game is old through some of its mechanics, its tank controls, and its graphics, but Resident Evil 3 is still a great game, and a worthy sequel to Resident Evil 2. The best place to start is undoubtedly with Nemesis himself. After all, Capcom realised how important Nemesis would be to the game. They put his name on the cover of the game as a subtitle, something they wouldn't do again for a mainline series entry until Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. You're stalker throughout the game, inspired by the unstoppable T-1000 hunting down John Connor in Terminator 2. He haunts your every move through Raccoon City and beyond, crashing through windows, charging you suddenly in buildings. If you hear him utter his signature catchphrase, you know it's too late. He's found you. Look, I've played Resident Evil 3 about 50 times, as well as watch plenty of speedruns of the game. I have a pretty deep understanding of all of Nemesis's trigger points, where and when he'll spawn, how far he chases you if you should decide to run from him, which choices lead to which Nemesis encounters. When replaying the game in 2020, Nemesis held very few surprises for me. But that doesn't mean I can't appreciate how awesome a gameplay mechanic he was, or how memorable those first encounters with him were, particularly when replaying the game and having him spawn in completely different locations. Credit to the original development team, because in Resident Evil 3, Nemesis felt a lot more dynamic because of all this than he actually was. He'll give chase relentlessly if you try to run, he's incredibly difficult to kill if you decide to stand your ground. He'll kick your butt if you give him an inch. And he does this throughout the game, constantly appearing to harass Jill and Carlos as they attempt to survive the apocalyptic nightmare that Raccoon City has become. I compare and contrast this with Remake Nemesis, which I was always going to do given that I was replaying the game after playing the 2020 version. Nemesis appears to chase you twice. Both times are fairly heavily scripted, and should you get too far away, he'll just jump in front of you, even if you've climbed the ladder up about 5 floors of a building. He just crashes onto the roof like he didn't just leap a tall building in a single bound. Worse still, if you decide to try and fight him during these 2 sections, a single grenade is enough to stun him on normal and get him to drop some sweet loot. I found this out by accident during my first and only playthrough of Remake 3. His constant hopping in front of me was getting really annoying, which isn't the emotion I'd imagine the devs were going for, so I thought I'd try to slow him down with a hand grenade. I turned, threw the grenade, and watched him drop to the ground in stunned disbelief. And then after the first hour or 2 of the game, Nemesis was relegated to appearing during cutscenes, setting up the next boss fight, or heavily scripted chase sequences. The Nemesis I remembered, the one that I had hoped Capcom would build upon for their remake, was a creature I was afraid of. He was powerful, dangerous, and in those first few playthroughs of the game, I was genuinely anxious that he could be around any corner. In 1999's Resident Evil 3, Nemesis invoked a sense of dread. In 2020's Remake 3, he invoked a sense of annoyance. He was a nuisance, not a threatening and persistent obstacle. Nemesis wasn't the only thing Resident Evil 3 had going for it. While the game featured less story content than its predecessors, thanks to a lack of alternate characters to play through the game as, or a lack of a second campaign, Capcom attempted to alleviate some of this with a focus on replayability. Thanks to a healthy dose of RNG, the live choices system, and Mercenaries mode, the latter of which I'll get to later. A lot of Resident Evil 3 relied on RNG. I've already discussed how the locations that Nemesis would spawn could change, but the game's randomness wasn't limited to its titular antagonist. The order in which weapons spawned could change between playthroughs. Certain rooms could spawn different enemies. Where you might encounter dogs in your first playthrough, you might encounter hunters the next time, for example. Puzzle solutions could also be different from run to run. Yeah, that's right. Resident Evil 3 still had puzzles that required thought and reasoning, unlike Remake 3, which jettisoned puzzles for some reason, as well as like 2/3 of the original game. Actually, just to linger on Nemesis again for a moment, even the way he chased you could change. Like at one point during my 2020 playthrough of the game, I thought he was behind me, but then I saw him climb over a gate ahead of me. I didn't know he could do that. I always assumed he would spawn behind you off camera, so the game never had to show him transitioning between areas, which he couldn't do. It scared the bejesus out of me. Even after all my playthroughs in the summer of 2000 and watching various different speedruns, Nemesis still managed to do something new, remain scary, and surprise me. There are even some minor elements of non-linearity in the game. These mostly take the form of the game's live choice system. At certain key parts of the story, Resident Evil 3 will freeze for a moment and present you with a binary choice, such as asking you whether you want to fight Nemesis or dodge him and escape into the RPD. The differences in these choices were fairly minor, usually just dictating which path you take to get to the next area, or where you'd start exploring, say, the clock tower or the factory. Other times you get slightly different dialogue, or Nemesis would pursue you or not, depending on how you chose to deal with him. And I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that one choice towards the tail end of the game would dictate how one character would die and the ending you get, whether you'd escape Raccoon City in a Carlos-piloted helicopter or a Barry Burton-piloted one. Spoiler alert for a 20-year-old game, I guess. But there's also the first half of the game, which take place in the various streets and buildings of Raccoon City, when you've got to find the different components you need to fix the train that will, theoretically, let you escape the city. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go to plan. You got everything you need to go and grab these items in any particular order you see fit, which is pretty neat for a game that came out in 1999 and or 2000. This is also how you can get Nemesis to spawn and pursue you in different locations. The order you choose to visit the pharmacy, gas station, power substation, and other places will decide where and when you'll have to face or run from Nemesis. No, and you can also totally meet Carlos in different places and have mildly different cutscenes with him depending on whether you go to the restaurant or the press office first, which can also influence the next Nemesis encounter. Basically, without just describing in great detail all of the different ways you can play Resident Evil 3, there's a lot of differences if you choose to go to different places in a different order, which is really neat. Not by modern gaming standards. Nowadays it's hard to avoid a game that adapts itself to the myriad choices you make, but it was something no other Resident Evil game had done before, or since, now that I think about it. And now that I've said that, there's probably one really obvious example that I'm forgetting, but I'm not changing it and you can't stop me. From a gameplay perspective, Resident Evil 3 also took the game in a more action-heavy direction than either of its predecessors, replacing the tense survival in cramped corridors of the Spencer Mansion or RPD with a more desperate tone, as you attempted to survive against hordes of Umbrella-mutated creatures as a city burned around you. Truth be told, Resident Evil 3 still mostly took place in corridors, but it's amazing what a skybox, some howling wind, and slightly wider corridors could do to the feeling of being in a more open environment. The new focus on action was immediately apparent, given the game hands you a fully automatic assault rifle right out of the gate, depending on the difficulty setting you choose to play on. Ammunition for the various weapons in your arsenal isn't very scarce at all, but neither are large groups of enemies. And Resident Evil 3 introduced the gunpowder system, where you could find different coloured gunpowder that you could make vast quantities of every ammunition type in the game, depending on how you mixed it. At about the halfway mark of my playthrough, I had more ammo than I'd ever need for just about every weapon I was carrying, which was a nice change of pace of the mild ammo management for previous games. In Resident Evil 1 and 2, I constantly tried to save my most powerful ammo in case I needed it for a boss fight or another tough enemy encounter. By around hour 2 of Resident Evil 3, I was able to cut loose and have a lot more fun blasting enemies thanks to my huge stacks of shotgun shells, freeze rounds, and magnum bullets. It is of course worth noting that Resident Evil 3 uses the static cameras and tank controls that defined the early parts of the franchise. I say worth noting because there are some players who just can't get to grips with the game controls, even back in 1999 when we didn't know any better, which is fair. If you're not used to tank controls, then I'd imagine Resident Evil 3 could feel really clunky, and there's a definite learning curve involved in getting to grips with and mastering how the characters in early Resident Evil games moved and controlled. Because Resident Evil 3 was a more action-heavy entry than its predecessors, the developers added a couple of new mechanics to help you survive the increased numbers of enemies. The dodge mechanic, which was a neat idea but kind of weird in execution given its button mapping. You can dodge an incoming enemy in Resident Evil 3, if you're aiming at them and you hit the fire weapon button at the right time. Most of the time I activated a dodge was by accident when I was trying to shoot an enemy, rather than actively trying to dodge an incoming lunge or other attack. In Remake 3 the dodge function is mapped to its own button, which is one of the only ways Remake 3 took something from the original game and made it better. Resident Evil 3 also introduced the 180 quick turn, a feature that has become a staple of not just the Resident Evil games that followed it, but also a lot of third-person action games in general. The 180 quick turn is such an iconic part of Resident Evil that I kept trying to use it when I was playing Resident Evil 2 ahead of playing this game, only to keep being painfully reminded that it didn't exist yet. Both of these mechanics, along with the increased ammo count and much faster weapon progression, helped a great deal in letting you survive and manage the sometimes quite large amount of enemies the game would throw at you, relative to the two other games in the series at this point. In fact, it's this action-focused gameplay that led to Resident Evil 3's secret weapon, Mercenaries, a compelling secondary game mode unlocked upon completing the main game for the first time. In Mercenaries you pick one of 3 UBCS mercs you meet in the game's story, and each character has a different loadout of weapons with different strengths and weaknesses. Then you're tasked with crossing Raccoon City within a certain time limit, which you can extend by killing the many enemies in your way, or by taking detours from the main path to rescue NPCs, who reward you with the only item pickups in the mode, as well as extra time. Depending on how well you perform during a run, you'll be given a grade and some cash that can be used to unlock features for the main game, such as unlimited ammo special weapons. Mercenaries is a really excellent addition to Resident Evil 3, no doubt added to alleviate some of the criticisms that the game only had a single campaign and a single protagonist. Getting a higher grade was a summer of 2000 obsession between me and my Resident Evil obsessed friends, and dipping my toe back into Mercenaries after concluding my 2020 playthrough of Resident Evil 3 caused me to become hooked all over again. I played a lot of Mercenaries, not because I was trying to get the highest grade or unlock new stuff for Jill in the main game, but because I was having an awesome time playing it. I said in my review of Remake 3 that I was disappointed Mercenaries had been replaced by Project Resistance, and that disappointment was hugely amplified after I actually went back and remembered just how fun Mercenaries was, and still is. It could have been such a fantastic addition to Remake 3, especially given that the RE engine and the new gameplay style of the modern day remakes would have fit Mercenaries perfectly. So that's pretty much where I'm at with my research into Resident Evil 3. I loved this game when I was 15 and playing it for an entire summer with my friends, and by replaying it again 20 years later, I've put to rest the gnawing doubt at the back of my mind that it wasn't as good as I remember that had been put out there by various game critics and people I follow on Twitter talking about how lukewarm the game's reception was at launch, not to mention that Time magazine article. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis is excellent. I'm really glad I decided to replay it, especially after being as disappointed with Remake 3 as I was. And hey, if you enjoyed Remake 3 or you didn't find as many flaws with it as I did, that's awesome. You do you. For me, Remake 3 felt like a shell of the game it was trying to recreate, which was something I felt much more keenly after having replayed the game it was trying to recreate. Resident Evil 3 feels like a complete game. Nemesis is a terrifyingly omnipresent threat. Exploring Raccoon City feels engaging, the focus on action feels like an organic next step for the franchise, and the RNG and life choices do wonders for the game's replayability. Sure, Resident Evil 3 might not quite be as good a game as Resident Evil 2, but that doesn't mean it's a mediocre game. In fact, it's a great one. Having played it again 20 years later, I can confidently say that it holds up pretty damn well.